Good morning. It's great to see everybody this morning. Glad that you're here. We've got a few families that have been out of town at some point over the last week or week and a half, and we're thankful that you've made it back safe. No others are going to be traveling throughout the summer, and we hope the same for each of you. Got a lot of stuff coming up over the next couple of weeks. Some of it was mentioned in the announcements, and hope that you will keep in mind again the Youth Devo tonight, the Summer Youth Series tomorrow night out of Glendale, Family Bible School next week. Let me mention three other things that are going to come up in the next 2 weeks that I failed to get mentioned, but need to be mentioned real quick. Number one, these are recent developments, that's why I haven't got them in the announcements. Number one, for any men or young men who would be available next Saturday morning, we are going to try to get a group together and go back up to the camp. We've got some dirt work that needs to be done and clearing some brush and stuff out so that we have a little bit of a smoother water slide and stopping point at the bottom instead of some trees that sometimes we run into. So if you would be available next Saturday morning to help us do some dirt work or to clear some small trees and some brush out, we're going to try to leave here. I'm going to make an executive decision here at 8:30. Sound good? We'll leave the building at 8:30. That'll put us up there about 9, and we'll try to get about 3 or 4, 5 hours in. Just do what needs to be done, and then we'll be done with it. There's a group from Glendale that's going to come too, so that'll make the burden a little bit less. So if you'd be willing to come out and help us with that, next Saturday morning we'll leave here at 8:30. Next Sunday morning we have a treat. One of our graduating students down in Memphis is going to be with us. I've been trying to get this worked out with him for a few weeks, and he's graduating Father's Day, so we were kind of coming down to the end. But Jesse Childress is from the Greenfield congregation. We've supported Jesse and his wife Christina the last 2 years down in Memphis. He will be graduating in 3 weeks, and he is going to and his wife are going to be with us next Sunday morning. He'll be teaching the auditorium class, and then he'll be preaching that morning. Jeff will be preaching that night. I've got to go and preach at Bishop Street next Sunday and fill in for them. So we're glad to have Jesse come up and then Jeff preaching that night. Then Bible school starts that next night, Monday, and that'll go Monday through Wednesday. And then the last 2 or 3 years, I've had a few ask me about this, and I kind of went back and forth about whether we try to do it or not, because we've had a hard time getting enough people together to do it. But I've had enough ask me about it. I thought we'd go ahead and try and just see what happened. That next Saturday, the 13th, we'll try to have another softball game and picnic for anybody who'd like to come out. We'll do it up at the Activity Center. And I think we usually start playing about 10. So anybody who'd be interested in coming out and playing softball with us, we'll play 10 o'clock Saturday morning, June the 13th, the Saturday after Bible school. Bring your friends out. Like I said, we've had a hard time getting enough to have really 2 teams. So young folks, young adults, anybody, come on out, bring some friends, get them out there. We can use that as a good opportunity even to get folks around some of the Christians in this area. But it's just going to be an opportunity to unwind after Bible school and have fun. So we'll plan on playing softball 10. We'll eat about 12 if you'd just like to come and eat. We have some who do that. We'll eat about 12 under the pavilion out there if it's available. Just picnic style, sandwiches, cookies, drinks, just whatever you'd like to bring to eat. We'll plan on doing that. So got a lot coming up over the next couple of weeks. Thanks for all those who came out to the camp last night. We had a good crowd for the fish fry and fundraiser, and we're going to have a great summer out there. Throughout the last month, we've spent the last few weeks talking about evangelism. And we've tried to this month move the conversation about evangelism and evangelistic efforts outside of the realm of the collective effort that we are trying to put forward as a congregation, not because the collective effort that we're trying to put forward is unimportant, but because this month we've really wanted to emphasize how we can make evangelism more of a personal effort and answer the question, what is it that I can do as an individual New Testament Christian to be more active and more engaged and perhaps even more effective in evangelistic work? And throughout this month, as we've kind of developed these thoughts from the Bible about what it is we can do to be more evangelistic and to be more effective and more engaged in the work of the church, we've talked a lot about different generic realities that need to exist. For instance, the first Sunday that we talked about this, we talked about how that we need to be praying about it. And throughout the month of May, we challenged ourselves to every single day, both on an individual level and as families, spend some portion of our day praying about growth, praying about evangelistic opportunities, praying about doors being opened to us that we might have the ability to reach out and to help individuals understand and accept the Bible. The second week we talked about how we need to prepare ourselves. That is, number one, we need to prepare ourselves mentally. We need to study and come to a good understanding of what the Bible says for two reasons. Number one, because we can't tell people what we do not know. That sounds simplistic, but I don't care how simplistic it is, it's true. How would you feel if you sent your child to school every day to sit in the classroom of a teacher who did not know what they were talking about? I've been in settings like that, and possibly you have too, and it's unproductive, it's wasteful time. And at the same time, we cannot afford to try to put ourselves in a position of teaching someone the truth if we don't know it. Not only is that not productive, it's actually counterproductive. And so number one, we need to prepare our minds so that we're able to tell people what they need to know because we first committed it to our lives. Number two, we need to take that knowledge and prepare our lives. We cannot afford to be hypocrites trying to tell others what they need to do to live. It's not going to do us any good. It's not going to do them any good. We need to build lives that maintain credibility and offer an example, an illustration to people in the world of what it means to be a Christian. We need to be that little light shining out into the world, Matthew chapter 5. And then last week we talked about how we need to make evangelism personal. And we talked about some things that we can do to make evangelism personal and take it personal, some realities that we need to come to in our mind with regard to the urgency and the extent of our mission and the value of our mission and all the things that surround that. But you know, really up to this point we've been generic. And that's good because those generic things that we've talked about have provided a good foundation. They've helped us to get some rudimentary understanding of some background realities that have to exist before we can really launch into an effective ministry as a servant and as a child of God. But at some point you've got to move out of the generic realm and start talking about some specific things that we can do to actually be active in taking the gospel to the lost. Souls are dying. And last Sunday night we talked about how they are dying at a rapid pace. I believe, if memory serves me correctly, the statistic we cited was 2 souls every single second. In the course of the time that we spend studying this morning, over 6,000 people in this world will pass into eternity. And the vast majority of them will not be prepared. Romans 10 and verse 14, we talked about this last week. Paul gave this series of questions really in backward form to try to help those Roman Christians arrive to an understanding of how you get get to point C from point A. And he did this backwards so that they could map the route that they would have to take to get to that point. And this is what he said. Verse 13, he had made that general statement that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And so you get to the point to where an individual is saved, but how do they get there? Well, verse 14 says this, how shall they call on Him in whom they do not believe? And how shall they believe in Him or on Him whom they have not heard? But then that final question is the one that needs to be most personal to us. How shall they hear that will develop the belief, that will develop the willingness to obey? How can they do that without a preacher? And folks, he's not talking about someone who serves in the official capacity. He's not talking about someone who just stands behind the pulpit. He's talking about how shall they hear unless somebody, anybody, as a child of God, an evangelist, a servant, a minister of the gospel, go and teach it to them. He's talking about every single one of us. They cannot get from point A to point C unless we be willing to insert ourselves into their lives and decide we are going to make a difference, no matter what it costs. 2 Timothy 4:5, Paul exhorted Timothy to do this. Be sober in all things. Suffer hardship. Do the work of an evangelist. And make full proof of thy ministry. Timothy had an incredible amount of responsibility that was going to have to be exercised among the people around whom he worked. But not just because he had accepted within his life the role of standing in a public forum and publicly proclaiming with the spoken word what God's truth had to say, but because he was a Christian. And so really you can look at 2 Timothy 4:5 and not just see it as an admonition to a preacher. 2 Timothy 4:5 is an admonition to a Christian. 2 Timothy 4:2, preach the Word. That's not an admonition just to a preacher. It's an admonition to a Christian. 2 Timothy 2:2, but those things which thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men, who shall be able to teach others also. That's not an admonition to a preacher. That is an admonition to a Christian. And so we're talking about matters that concern all of us, not responsibilities that we have the luxury of shifting simply onto the shoulders of a few, but a burden that we have all got to bear. And so this morning, I want us to take some time as we kind of wrap up this particular series today and talk about 3 practical suggestions, 3 everyday things that we can do that would help us be more active and more engaged and perhaps more effective as personal evangelists. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview tonight. Over the last week, I was doing some study into this and I was doing some internet searches. And I came across an article. It's not written by a New Testament Christian, but I came across an article that went through and talked about not really some specific things that we can do necessarily, but what this article went through and talked about was some questions we need to ask ourselves that will help us determine the best approach for different individuals and the best approach for us to take as we try to reach people with the gospel. I want to tonight go through and just talk about some of those principles that individual outlined. Like I said, to me it was a very productive conversation that they had in the course of that article, and I want to share some of those things with you tonight. This morning, though, 3 practical suggestions of things that we can do to be more effective in our work as evangelists of the gospel. Number 1, and this was not going to take anybody by surprise, but it is going to be one that we are probably at times going to be the least likely to want to do, but something honestly that we can't avoid if we're going to be active in evangelism. And that is, number 1, we've got to be bold. We tend to live inside our own personal bubbles of comfort and convenience. And in a lot of respects, there's nothing wrong with that, given different contexts. When it comes to people's eternal souls, though, we don't have the luxury of being able to maintain ourselves simply within our own little bubbles of comfort and convenience and never step outside of them. We simply don't. In our lives, regardless of how outgoing we may naturally believe ourselves to be, at times we simply have to just be bold in the way that we approach talking to people about the gospel. At times in the New Testament, when you see individuals converted, I'm thinking particularly from the book of Acts, the book of conversions. When you see individuals converted in the book of Acts, a lot of times, not necessarily all the time, but a lot of times, it's just because someone who may not have known the person to whom they were fixing to talk, but that person who was a New Testament Christian was willing to just come out and say what needed to be said. Now, they did so in a kind, considerate, loving, and effective way. They did not come across hateful, arrogant, obnoxious, or irritable, but in a kind and compassionate and loving and merciful way. At times you see individuals simply approaching individuals who needed to hear the truth and them just telling it to them. Now, let me give you one example of what I'm thinking of in Acts chapter 8. You remember that Philip had been commissioned by God to go down into the way that went from Jerusalem unto Gaza. And God just simply told Philip that when he got there, He'd tell him what else He needed him to do, which He did. And so when God told Philip to go into that way between Jerusalem and Gaza, well, guess what Philip did? He went. That's what you do when God tells you to do something. And so Philip goes from where he was all the way over to the way that went between Jerusalem and Gaza. And when he got there, he saw this individual sitting in his chariot reading from the Old Testament. And God told Philip, you go and you talk to him. And so in Acts chapter 8, beginning somewhere around, I'm thinking verse 23, 24, 25. In Acts chapter 8, though, do you remember that when Philip got there, he saw that man, God told him to go and join himself to that chariot, he said. And so Philip walks up to that eunuch, who we find out later, he traveled all the way from Ethiopia up to Jerusalem to observe the most recent feast, and he was on his way home. And he was stopped there in that way between Jerusalem and Gaza, and he was just reading from the Scriptures. That's a pretty good position to find someone, right? That's a pretty good context in which to strike up a biblical discussion. And so he walks up to this individual and he's reading from the Old Testament Scriptures. And from reading Acts chapter 8, we find out that he's reading from Isaiah chapter 53. And notice how Philip approached him. He walked up to him and he said, "Do you understand what you're reading?" That was it. He sees a man reading the Bible and he sees an open door. And he simply walks up to him and he says, "What's that mean? Do you understand what it means?" And that simple act slung a door wide open that Philip was able to take advantage of, ultimately leading to that man's conversion. You remember the eunuch said, "How can I understand it except some man guide me or someone help me?" And so Philip and the eunuch just sat there in the chariot for the next few minutes or maybe a few hours. I don't know. Acts 8 doesn't say, but they sat there for whatever time it took. And Philip taught him about Jesus. Isaiah 53 is about Jesus anyway, right? And so he started where the man was. And he taught him about Jesus. And you know how the story ends. Eventually they come across a body of water, and the eunuch, having been taught by Philip about Jesus, said, "Well, here's water. What's keeping me from being baptized?" And Philip said, "Well, if you believe with all your heart, you may." And the eunuch said, "Well, I do believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God." And they both went down into the water. Philip baptized him, and he came up out of the water. Philip was called away, and the eunuch went on his way rejoicing. Why? Because somebody was willing to be bold, to step outside of what might have been a comfort zone and walk up to an individual and just simply say, "What are you reading? Can we talk about it?" At times we have to do just like Philip did. We just have to be willing to step outside of our comfort zones and say what needs to be said. Now, I give this disclaimer as I did before. Saying what needs to be said doesn't mean that we're obnoxious. It doesn't mean that we come across as being arrogant. It doesn't mean that we come across as irritable or hateful. That saying what needs to be said gives us a license to be mean. It doesn't. Saying what needs to be said can just as easily be said from an attitude and a heart of kindness and love and compassion and long-suffering. But nonetheless, at times we just simply have to step outside of our comfort zones and say what needs to be said. Why is it that often we do not? I would dare say here's reason number one above all others. The thought that crosses our minds is, what if they reject it? I mean, what if I put myself out there on the limb? What if I step outside of my comfort zone and they just shut me down? What if they reject it? What if they're not willing to listen to me? Well, guess what? Nothing's changed. Really, what has changed in that situation? Have you somehow lost your salvation because somebody else rejected the truth? No. Has their spiritual situation changed whatsoever? Unfortunately, no. Now, we might feel embarrassed. We might get our feelings hurt depending on the way that they reject it. We may feel vulnerable, isolated, whatever. Those are emotions that simply we just have to work through. But the mentality, the question, the skepticism, well, what if they reject it? We haven't lost anything. They had the opportunity to hear the gospel. Think about it not in terms of what they reject. Think about it in terms of what opportunity has been given to them. At least they had an opportunity to hear the truth. If they reject it, that's a matter that's between them and God. It's not something that we can control. And I'll tell you this, nowhere in the Bible does God command to such an extent that my eternal salvation will hang in the balance. Nowhere in the Bible does God place the entire burden of converting an individual souls on my shoulder. He doesn't do that. Now, I'll tell you the burden He does place on our shoulders. The burden He places on our shoulders is teaching, telling people the truth. Now, whether they accept it or not, I have no control over that, neither do you. In fact, God doesn't even have control over that. That's a matter that is personal to that individual. It's a matter between them and God. And so whether a person accepts it, whether a person rejects it, that's not something for which really I'm responsible. If they accept it, I'm not responsible for that. I'm just telling them what God told me to tell them. If they reject it, I'm not responsible for that either, really. If I did so in a kind and proper way, I'm not responsible if they reject it because I'm just telling them what God told me to tell them. Matthew chapter 13, you remember that Jesus illustrated to us in that parable of the soils that sadly, most of the time, when we try to plant a seed in someone's heart, it's going to be rejected. Even the most capable of soul winners tend to be rejected the majority of the time. Jesus was rejected the majority of the time. We cannot use the excuse that we fear rejection to never step foot into the water and actually do it. Number one, we've got to be bold. Perhaps it's the case we all have to find our own voice. We all have to find our own way of approaching someone. But at the end of the day, we have to be bold. We have to be willing to step outside of that comfort zone and just simply do what God said because He told us to do it and because people's souls hang in the balance. How are we going to respond? Number two, not only do you see in the New Testament the principle, like in Acts chapter 8, that to be evangelistic, we just have to be bold. Number two, you see examples in the New Testament of those who at times were inventive, who took advantage of opportunities perhaps not in the way that even they before would have thought about. They might have found themselves in situations that they never would have imagined finding themselves in, or they might have found themselves responding to situations in ways that they never could have imagined responding to them. But in the unlikeliest of situations, perhaps in the worst of situations, perhaps in the most different of situations, at times you see God's servants in the New Testament just simply being inventive in the way that they talk to people about the truth. An example of this that came to my mind was in Acts chapter 16. Probably the more familiar account in Acts chapter 16 is the one we're going to talk about. When Paul and Silas found themselves in prison. Now, if in 2015 a New Testament Christian found themselves in prison, at least in America, that really probably wouldn't be the greatest situation to be in because we would probably actually be guilty of something that was wrong instead of what Paul and Silas had done. Paul and Silas was in there just because they'd been preaching and the people didn't like it, and so they threw them in prison, which was pretty common back then. But they're in prison. Now, I mean, if you're in prison, what would your response to being in prison be? We'd be upset, wouldn't we? We would be beside ourselves. We would be thinking every second that we're in there, what is it that I can do to get out? and go back about my life normally. Well, being in prison was kind of old hat for Paul at this point, so he was perhaps a little bit more used to it than we would have been, or any newbie would have been to this situation. But Paul and Silas find themselves in prison, and instead of being or having this woe is me pity party, and being worried from one moment to the next of what was going to happen, what's going to go from here, how am I going to get out, Paul and Silas instead used that situation, which was less than ideal, to try to do some good, didn't they? And so we pick up the narrative in Acts chapter 16, remembering that around midnight, Paul and Silas were doing what? They were singing praises unto God. And you remember around that time that an earthquake occurred, no doubt an act of God. An earthquake that loosed the shackles of the prisoners, opened the cell doors, and gave them an opportunity to escape. In fact, the jailer, you remember, had just assumed they had escaped because he couldn't imagine shackles being loosed and prison doors being opened and prisoners voluntarily staying behind. So he was ready to kill himself because, Rome was going to execute him anyway if he allowed those prisoners to escape. And Paul and Silas hollered out to him, "Do thyself no harm, for we are all here." And the jailer came in, and Paul and Silas used the unlikeliest of situations to open a door by which they could teach this individual and even his whole family the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's exactly what they did. The jailer asked them, knowing apparently that there was something divine going on, what it is that he needed to do. And he took them home and gave Paul and Silas the opportunity to teach them, and they ultimately were converted. Would you dare say that Paul and Silas were just a tad bit inventive in Acts chapter 16? I would say so. And being evangelistic sometimes takes that. Being evangelistic doesn't always mean that we just walk up to someone, friend or stranger, and just out of the blue start talking to them about the Bible. Sometimes it does mean that, and if we can do that, that's great. Sometimes evangelism takes a whole different form. And we just have to use whatever circumstances exist around us and manipulate them to provide a door that's open. Sometimes we just have to open that door ourselves. And that's what Paul and Silas had done there. Now, the way that we can do that today, we could spend weeks just listing things that we could do. So obviously I can't go through every scenario of possibility that exists in our lives today, what we can do to do the same thing. But maybe a few suggestions could be in order. Maybe being inventive in evangelistic work today means that we strategically share certain content, like articles or sermons or devotionals or whatever, personally with an individual. I tell you, what one of the greatest avenues we have today to do stuff like that is through social media. We have an opportunity to reach the greatest amount of people we can in the shortest amount of time. And when used properly, social media can be a great tool in that regard. Now, I will give this disclaimer. Social media is not a place for productive discussion. That's the rule. Now, there may be exceptions to that rule. I have seen exceptions to that rule. I've never experienced an exception to that rule, but I have seen it. But by rule, social media is usually not the best place for discussion or debate. People hide behind a keyboard, and that keyboard and general anonymity tends to unleash a crueler side of people that just simply wouldn't exist on a face-to-face basis. But it is a great place to just simply share this, share that, get it out there, let people read it. Person may not necessarily be directly converted from that effort, but it might be an opportunity where eyes are opened and someone begins seeking further from that. Sometimes you just have to get inventive. Maybe it means I heard someone not long ago announce this at a congregation where we were visiting. They were talking about having some material in the back, and we have some material in the back that we could just as easily use this for if you would so desire. Maybe being inventive in evangelism means that you take one of our brochures or one of our postcards, and when you go to lunch this afternoon. Now I'm going to give this disclaimer. If you're a bad customer or you're a bad tipper, don't do this. I don't want anything from Phillip Street on the table of someone who's a bad customer and a bad tipper. If you're either one of them, don't let them know you're from here. But if you're a good customer and you're a fair tipper, maybe it means taking one of the brochures or one of our postcards, and when you leave your tip on the table, or you could personally hand it to your waiter or waitress, or at least just leave it on the table. And when they pick it up, you know what they might do? They might rip it up and they might throw it in the trash can. What they might do is they might read it. They might go to our website, they might go to our YouTube channel, and they might dig a little bit. And you never know what could come of it. Maybe being inventive means that you just show kindness to someone initially. That you don't necessarily jump in and just start immediately talking to someone about the Bible. Maybe it means you find out they have a need. And with absolutely no strings attached. Imagine that. With no strings attached, you just do something nice for them. You find out, there's a neighbor that maybe they're a little bit older and they just can't do it, but they need something done in their flower bed or in their yard. And you just go do it. Not necessarily immediately as a pretext to discuss the Bible, but just to show kindness, just to shine that Christian light. Now, over time, it might develop into that, and that obviously is something that we could look forward to. But maybe it just means you show kindness to someone. Just be a Christian. How inventive would that be? Oh, there's so many things that we can do. Sometimes, though, you just have to be inventive. Sometimes you just have to think a little bit about, I find myself in this situation, I find myself in this context, I find myself in this location, I find myself around this particular person. What is it that I could do to maybe just stick my foot in the door as an opportunity to somewhere down the road do some good in their life? Be inventive. Be bold. Real quick, number 3. Sometimes we need to be flexible. Sometimes there are hurdles, there are roadblocks that stand in the way of reaching those around us that could honestly easily be avoided if only we could find it within ourselves to be flexible in certain areas. And I'm not talking about doctrine, okay? So just get that out of your head right now. I'm not talking about being flexible on doctrine. But there are roadblocks, there's stumbling blocks, there's obstructions sometimes that have nothing to do with doctrine, that sometimes they're the only thing standing between us and being able to make a meaningful impact in a person's life, if only we could find it within ourselves to be flexible. And let me give you an example of that. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. This is exactly what Paul said. Beginning in verse 19. For though I was free from all men, I brought myself under bondage to all. Why? Why was he willing to sacrifice his freedom in certain situations, in certain contexts, and be willing to be brought under bondage in those situations or contexts? That I might gain the more. To the Jews, I became as a Jew, that I might gain Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, not being myself under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are without law, as without law, not being without law to God, but under law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak, He said, I became weak, that I might gain the weak. I am become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some. Basically, what Paul was saying here was that if something stood between him and being able to reach someone with the gospel, being able to have some kind of impact in their lives, if it was not going to compromise his integrity, if it was not going to compromise his faith, if it was not going to compromise his stand for truth, if it was just a matter of culture or opinion or whatever, Paul was basically saying, my opinion about something is not so great that I'm not willing to sacrifice that or compromise that opinion for the sake of saving somebody's eternal soul. Now, those roadblocks, those obstructions may have to do with culture. It may have to do with maturity level. It may have to do with economic status. It may have to do with a lot of different things that sometimes can stand between us and having an impact in someone's lives. And Paul said when those minor details arose, he said, I was willing to forego my freedom in those areas and become whatever I needed to become to whoever it was I needed to become it to reach them. Because their soul is more important than being more rigid in some area than I really need to be to begin with. Now, there's an example of something that Paul did in Acts chapter 16 that illustrates this perfectly. Timothy, now this was shortly after he had been introduced to Timothy and his family, and Timothy began working with him. You remember Timothy's background. He was half Jew and half Gentile, half Greek. And so Timothy apparently had not been circumcised as was traditional among the Jews. Legally he didn't have to because the law at that point was in none effect. Or scripturally he didn't have to. Legally he didn't have to because he was half Gentile. His father was a Gentile, and so he didn't really have to be circumcised. So he hadn't been. But in Acts 16:3, you remember that Paul had a purpose for Timothy in working among the Jews, right? And so Acts 16:3 just simply says that before Timothy began his work among the Jews, Paul did something. He went and he circumcised him. What? Why, Paul? Was it really that big of a deal to Paul? No, it really wasn't. Paul didn't care if he was circumcised or not. It didn't make a hill of beans difference. Did it matter to Timothy? Absolutely not. Did it matter to anybody who had any true sense of God's law, of Christ's law whatsoever? No, it didn't. But you know who it mattered to? It mattered to the Jews to whom Timothy was being sent. That one simple act would give Timothy credibility among a group of people to whom at that point he had no credibility as one who was uncircumcised. And so in a matter that had absolutely no scriptural bearing whatsoever, Paul said, Timothy, technically speaking, you don't have to do this. It doesn't matter. But if you want to have any credibility and make any impact among this group of people, it's something that you're probably going to have to do. And so Timothy said, you know what? I'll become this to these individuals if I need to, that I might reach them. He was a little bit flexible, wasn't he? I would dare say that outside of sometimes not being willing to be bold, this might be right there at the top of reasons as to why sometimes we're not as effective in evangelism as we could be, because we are unwilling to be flexible in areas that make no matter whatsoever outside of opinion and preference and tradition. Sometimes, though, the situation just simply calls for us to be flexible. And when it does, then we need to be. There's so many other things that could be mentioned, should be mentioned, and that we could do to be more effective in our efforts as evangelists and teachers of the gospel. Some may be better at certain things than others, and vice versa. This is really the key, though, as we close this morning. When it comes to understanding what it is that we can do and we need to do to be effective in evangelism, we don't all have to be doing the exact same thing, but we all need to be doing something. As parts of the body, as Paul spoke of in 1 Corinthians, we all have some ability, something that we can do. And to be effective members of a body, then we need to be doing something. Find what it is that you can do, and do it. Do it to the best of your ability. As you do it, be bold, be inventive, and be flexible, but above all, do it. And it'll be amazing what we see that can be done. Come back tonight and we'll talk about some mentalities, some questions that we can ask ourselves that can help us get to a place to where we can be effective too as workers in God's kingdom. It might be the case here this morning, though, that you're not a child of God. And if that's the case, then we plead with you to reconsider your eternal destiny. If you believe that Jesus is the Son of God and you're willing to repent of your sin and confess your faith and be immersed, then do it this morning. Maybe you're a child of God, but you've gone into a life of sin and you need to come home. God is pleading with you to do that. Turn from your sins in repentance, confess them, pray to Him for forgiveness, and He offers you the assurance of His forgiveness if only you would come. If you have need, please come now while together we stand and sing.
Almost persuaded now to believe, almost persuaded Christ to receive. Sing